Mr. Min, thank you so much for allowing me to present here today. It is my honor on behalf of the American Conservative Union and CPAC to discuss election fraud and the erosion of democracy globally and the role of the U.S. in shoring up democracy around the world. But before I begin, I do want to thank so much KCPAC and the New Institute for making this possible. Their leadership is very, very important. And most importantly, I want to thank the patriots of South Korea, the patriots who continue to fight for freedom. And those patriots, those people in attendance, and the patriots of South Korea who are watching, you are patriots for freedom around the world. I thank you. On the topic of election fraud in South Korea during the general election of April 15th, sadly, we saw very bad things happen. But this is not new or unique in South Korea. It is a pattern that, like the coronavirus itself, is creeping into the democratic body throughout the world. A recent U.S. government report identified factors that undermine democracy globally. It found that electoral processes have been undermined more than any other democratic freedom in the last few years. Throughout the world, the basic right to elect leadership is being undermined by autocracies as they find ways to control the results. Yet they keep the illusion of competitive balloting by undermining the very mechanisms of voting machines through big data and collusion with software companies working as fronts with nefarious governments. And of course, I'm specifically referring to the Chinese Communist Party and corporations that are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. What is increasingly common around the world are polls where the outcome is shaped by coercion, fraud, gerrymandering, and other modes of manipulation. Our right to elect our own representatives is one of the key ways that people in democracies express themselves politically. Many see voting as a moral duty, and in some countries like Australia, it is the law. It is a way to protect ourselves and our fellow citizens from authoritarians. We believe when we vote that we as individuals make a difference. But what happens when our individual vote has little instrumental value because they are undermined by larger processes aimed at rigged outcomes? Rigging elections is inherently undemocratic. Of course, the U.S. is not immune from these attacks on representational democracy. Shockingly, the U.S. Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has implemented a proxy voting scheme so that she can control how every member of her own party votes on bills in Congress. The chamber of the Congress that is supposed to be the People's House has become the Pelosi House. Similarly disturbing, the governor of New Jersey has just ordered that mail-in ballots be sent to every voter in his state, even though they have not requested those ballots. But there is nothing to prevent these same voters, after they have already cast a mail-in ballot, from also going to a voting location on election day to cast another ballot. If this is allowed to stand, I promise you that more ballots will be cast than the total number of eligible voters in that state. This is also very anti-democratic. This has been a case globally for the last few years. The military and other security forces influenced key Asian elections and carried out gross rights violations against minorities. In Cambodia, the military police, and police openly campaigned for the ruling party. That party won all the seats in the legislative branch. Pakistan's elections were competitive, but the military's influence over the courts and the media was widely thought to have tilted the outcome in favor of Imran Khan, who took office as prime minister. In Myanmar, the military is accused by UN investigators of committing genocide against the Rohingya people, over 700,000 of whom have fled to Bangladesh since the start of violence in 2017. And of course, in China, it is estimated that over 1 million ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Hui have been forced into re-education centers. We are seeing more and more reports of the rights violations emerging from within these camps. Meanwhile, Communist Party leader Xi Jinping secured a potential life tenure when the National People's Congress rubber-stamped a decision to remove the Constitution's 2-year limit on the presidency. And similarly in Russia, a referendum passed allowed Putin to remain in power as president until at least 2036, but of course, that will go on forever. In South America, the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, extended his authoritarian rule with a profound, flawed presidential election. And in Nicaragua, President Daniel Ortega pursued a ferocious crackdown on nationwide anti-governmental protest movements. So what we see in South Korea in the April 15th general election should not come as a big surprise. However, it still does become a surprise to me because we associate South Korea with democracy and the rule of law. Since South Korea emerged from authoritarian rule in 1987 up to the present, we have witnessed a robust democracy and compounding economic growth. Citizens who engage their civil rights to protest and demand the leadership that represents them instead have seen their rights abused and their voting disregarded. Around the world, global freedom has diminished over the last 15 years. We have seen global freedom backsliding among new democracies, compounded by the erosion of political rights and civil liberties among established democracies such as South Korea and the United States. Just as we in America have called out foreign leaders for undermining democratic norms in their countries, we must draw attention to the same sorts of warning signs in the United States and in allied countries. Let us admit that the U.S. has an irreplaceable role as a champion of global freedoms, as it is a priority for us. And I want to comment that we do have KT McFarland and Fred Fleitz here, who have played very senior roles in this administration and who have done amazing work in this regard. But the difficulties facing democracy in the United States did not begin with the inauguration of President Trump. The health of U.S. democracy has been undermined since well before that. We saw an intensified political polarization and a weaponization of our government against its political opponents. This was during the Obama administration when his Department of Justice spied on the Trump campaign. Initially, the accusation was that President Trump was colluding with the Russians. Of course, that proved not to be true. Instead, the only campaign that was colluding with the Russians was the Hillary Clinton campaign. And her campaign actually paid Russian operatives to draft a fake dossier and created fantastic kinds of accusations. But the American system of government and democracy is robust. But that is not so everywhere. In Venezuela and Turkey, human rights agencies have reported that democratic institutions gradually succumbed to sustained pressure from an anti-democratic leadership. We are seeing a deterioration in democracy around the world. For over 4 years, the left in America has successfully taken up so much of President Trump's time in these baseless accusations. And it reminds me of something that Ronald Reagan taught us. And I read his quote directly. As we renew ourselves here in our own land, we will be seen as having greater strength throughout the world. We will again be the exemplar of freedom and a beacon of hope for those who do not now have freedom. Nearly 4 decades later, the idea that the United States is an exemplar is being steadily discredited. If we are to assess democracy, we must assess corruption and transparency. Those in the Obama administration who attacked candidate Trump and the president and President Trump himself, they need to be held to account. In the case of the United States and South Korea, we see much corruption and little transparency. So what did happen in Korea on April 15th, 2020? We saw officials use their position to enrich themselves and their political party. They tolerated conflicts of interest to sow public doubts about their own motivations. The result of this is that citizens lose faith in the system and begin to avoid their own responsibilities, including paying taxes, participating in elections, and obeying the law in general. To avoid such decay, it is imperative that government and citizens alike uphold ethical rules and norms against corruption. The United States benefits from a number of strong protections, including independent courts, congressional oversight, and active monitoring by the media and civil society. But it takes patriots like those in attendance here to hold everybody accountable. I pray that the patriots of South Korea will help us as we defend freedom and democracy around the world. As the Korean election comes into greater and greater doubt, I fear that it could be a harbinger of additional failures around the entire globe. With that, I want to thank you all again for including me, and it is an honor to be included among such great speakers. Thank you very much.